Welcome back. So, we have had Apple Music just recently dropped their top 100 albums of all time. So, I'm obviously not going to go through every single album on this list, obviously, because there's 100 of them. I wish I was as much of a music connoisseur as I think I am. I haven't listened to every single album on the list, unfortunately. I'm getting there though. But I wanted to pick out some notable ones that I find either are too high, they're too low, maybe some albums that shouldn't be here on here in the first place, and maybe some replacements instead of the albums that they chose. So I'm just gonna go down the list here, and then we're gonna have a little bit of a breakdown as to why I believe this list is getting as much controversy as it does. Which I mean, every single list when you put top albums of all time is going to get controversial anyways. So let's start off with Astroworld at 98. In my personal opinion, I would switch it to Rodeo, and I would drop it down just a tiny bit in the listing. Rodeo is incredibly influential and pivotal to the more kind of atmospheric and psychedelic trap sound that Travis really just trademarked and made it as popular as it is. Although I will say Astroworld definitely brought that sound a lot into the mainstream when you think of Sicko Mode, when you think of Butterfly Effect. Astroworld was definitely that sound put on its biggest display possible. So while I understand that Astroworld is placed on this list, I do believe the better quality album is Rodeo. And I may move it down maybe into like the early 90s instead of like the top, around the top of the 100. Rage Against the Machine's self-titled. I can't even say it right. Rage Against the Machine's self-titled. I still believe is an incredibly influential record. It still packs a lot of punch. It still packs a lot of resonance. It is aged incredibly well, especially considering the political climate and the way that we're kind of going back into the punky kind of direction. So at 97, I feel like it should be moved down just a little bit more down the listing because I do feel that that album is still quite impactful to this day. Pure Heroine at 96. Now, obviously, Pure Heroine had Royals. It had a couple other songs on there. Can't really think of their titles. Glory and Gore is another example. Honestly, I would have swapped it over with Melodrama. Melodrama was Lorde's definitely most artistic and best fully rounded album that she has made. Pure Heroine was huge at the time, obviously, with Royals and kind of the subversion of the pop trends that were back in the early 2010s. But I feel a body of work, I feel that Melodrama was a little bit more of a well-rounded and better constructed album. I would still keep it around the same score, though, because while Lorde was incredibly influential when it came to her sound, I don't know in an album context that it was as impactful as people want to push it up to be. So, now we move on to Flower Boy at 92, which was a major push forward for Tyler the Creator, both as an artist as well as a person in general. Kind of in the public eye, he was, of course, with all the controversies, with all the past albums, this was definitely a turning point in his career. But for myself, when it comes to the better album, I feel like Igor is definitely a lot more of a standout record, especially with the subversion of his sound, going into something a little bit more poppy, going into something that's kind of a mix of everything. But the way that it's capitalized, the way that the concept of the album really works out, and the daring risks that Tyler does on Igor, and they work out so well, I feel like it should have been replaced with Igor. And I feel like Igor, if Igor was on this list, I would move it down quite a bit. I would probably move it down to around the 70 to 60 range because, again, just the way that that album kind of just splashed onto the scene and really just put Tyler into this different stratosphere when it comes to a critically acclaimed artist. I feel like Igor should definitely be pushed more down towards the bottom of the list. Now, Golden Hour by Casey Musgraves. Now, I highly debated if even wondering if this album should even be on the list. Because while this album definitely is kind of the poppier, dreamier sounds being pushed into the country genre, and we're seeing the massive takeover and the massive renaissance that country is receiving, I feel like Golden Hour didn't really make as much of a splash as people think it did, as much as it did win an Album of the Year at the Grammys. I would probably push it more up into the very top of the 100 range. Because it's still a great record. Still, I love the blend of the dreamier sounds of pop and country. And I think the songwriting on that album is fantastic. And overall, I think that album just really kind of melded those sounds together nice and perfectly to where a casual listener just getting into country can really appreciate the sound of that. But I do think it should be pushed a lot more to the top of the 100 list than kind of where it's at an 85. Now, this one actually surprised me quite a bit. Marshall Mathers LP at 80. That should go down by a dramatic amount. As much as Eminem has fallen off artistically over the years, Marshall Mathers LP is one of the most important and one of the most impactful rap albums ever created. When it comes to the subjects it takes on, the way that Eminem just came onto the scene of controversy, but the way that he was able to bring the skill in that as well. There's so many eye-opening moments still on this album. There's still incredibly catchy moments. The rapping, the writing is top tier. I still don't know how it just got to 80. I would probably put it in the 50s and below because this album, as much as I'm not a big fan of new Eminem, Marshall Mathers LP is still one of the most impactful rap albums in its genre. SOS at 72 by SZA. This kind of goes down into the recency bias kind of category. As much as I do enjoy SOS, I'm not the biggest fan of SOS as others are. I guess that's the hot take that I have. I would definitely swap it out with Control. And Control is one of my favorite albums of all time. You have the sultry sounds when it comes to Supermodel. You have songs like Prom. You have sounds like Garden, Say Dat, Anything. There's so many incredible highlights across this album. Love Galore, obviously, with Travis. I feel like that album, again, I'm going to say it multiple times, but I feel like that album is just a better quality sound and definitely more the sound that's more to my catering and more to my liking. SOS is still a good album. I just felt like a little bit too bloated, and there's some portions of the album I find the attempts at some different sounds sometimes don't go as well as others. Trying to think of what song it is. It's the one that sounds a little bit more kind of punky, a little bit more kind of that Olivia Rodrigo kind of sound. But I would still keep, if I was to replace Control or replace SOS with Control, I would probably still keep it at the 72 range. Illmatic at a 39, I feel like that should go down at least a little bit lower. Incredible rap album. It's nice, trim, to the point, has some incredible writing, has some incredible lyricism, and Nas has such a powerful presence on the mic, and that still hits home today, and still one of the most important rap albums in its genre. So then we have Beyonce's self-titled, and this is going to be a brutal hot take for me. This shouldn't even be on the list. Mostly because I do appreciate with the self-titled album that it kind of pushed the trend of surprise dropping albums. I just feel that Beyonce has gone to do so much more impactful things, especially with her music. And we'll go down the list, of course, down in here where I do feel like the album is a little bit more impactful. But I feel like the Beyonce self-titled just didn't really do enough, at least for me, to warrant being on this list. It's still not a bad album. And that's what I want to say with all these two. Some albums that I find should go down, or some albums that should go up, or some albums that shouldn't exist on this list. It's not to say that I hate them. It's just when you consider that it's the top 100 albums of all time, you really have to consider quality. We can't just be throwing on albums willy-nilly. And that's kind of why I put a massive arrow up for When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go at 30. And it's funny because I was just talking about how this album was a pop classic, and I still believe it does, and I still believe it is. The way that it kind of made the darker sounds of pop really kind of be pushed into the mainstream. The way that Billie Eilish was the way that her presence and her identity was able to be put full front, and the way that it worked so well around its time. Like, she became established immediately in the scene, and she is highly critically acclaimed. I just don't know if putting When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go at 30 is way too low down on the list. If I was to put it anywhere, I probably would double it up maybe into the 60 range, because while it's still a great album and probably one of the more influential ones of the latter portion of the decade, when you consider the top 100 albums of all time, I just don't know if Billy kind of fits into that area. It's not on here as well, but Taylor Swift's 1989 Taylor's version, I believe, is either 18 or 19 on the list. As much as I want to say it shouldn't be on here, or maybe should be, I would say it's probably should be pushed up on the listing. That is 1989 is one of the biggest albums of like the past ever. It is huge. The amount of singles that album had was absolutely ridiculous. That album is still going to do numbers probably 20 years from now. So as much as I'm not a big fan of that album, it's one of her better records, honestly, in my opinion. And the way that it's had its relevance and the way that it's kind of kept itself in the public eye, even though it's a Taylor's version, I think the album is kind of okay where it is. I may move it up into the 30s, but that's besides the point. So then we have Lemonade at number 10. So this album, I do believe, is justified at being on this list. The way that it tackled the controversy at the time and the drama with Jay-Z and the cheating allegations, and, well, I guess the cheating thing is obviously that happened by this point. I do believe that this album was a massive kick in the door for Beyonce. The way that album is so aggressive, the way that it is so blunt, the way that it is so emotional, the way that it can evoke power and can evoke kind of this feeling of dominance. I do feel like this album does have a reason to be on this list. Number 10, I'm not 100% sure, but I do feel like it falls in that top 20 range. I do feel like that album, again, just has this kind of bravado and also this vulnerability to it that we didn't really see from Beyonce until around this time in 2016. And she's kind of brought more of her vulnerability forward on future records. So I feel like this album, Lemonade, really pushed the forefront of who Beyonce is as an artist and as a person. So I do reasonably understand why it's on this list. And then we have a Miseducation of Lauryn Hill at the number 1 spot. This is probably the most unorthodox pick on the list. I love the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. This sound of this album is absolutely timeless. This album has been sampled so many times, and for good reason. The sound of this album is smooth, it's silky, it has these moments of inspiration, it has the flows, it has the energy, it has the feel-good nature of it. I feel like the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill took a little bit to kind of be recognized by the public eye, and I think this will kind of push it into the forefront a good amount. I mean, I don't think it should be number 1, but I'm honestly not that upset that it's at number 1 because I can totally see why it is, because the album is just, when you really think about it, the fingerprints of this album are honestly everywhere, especially when it comes to the rap scene still. Like, this album is still getting referenced, it's still getting sampled, and Lauryn Hill as a presence on the mic, both as a singer and as a rapper, should not be understated. She released this one album, and it's considered one of the best for a reason. So, with all of this, and also, I guess I'll throw these into here too, since it's not displayed here. Good Kid, Mad City is at number 8. Reasonable placement. I feel like that's a pretty good spot where it is. Maybe move it down just a little bit more, possibly into the top 5 territory, but nonetheless, I think that album is a classic, and that album, like kind of the Taylor's version of 1989, I feel like that album will still be played in quite a bit of rotation 10 to 15 years from now. But this kind of plays into my big problem with this list. There is multiple albums from multiple artists on this list, and there was a lot of people kind of critiquing. It's just like, so why does Beyonce have a couple albums on this list? Why does Radiohead have numbers of albums on this list? Why does the Beatles have a certain number of albums on this list? There is a few artists that had 2 to possibly 3 albums that showed up on this top 100 list. And in my personal opinion, you should really go with the best of the best. You should not throw on multiple albums on this list, because it causes problems like T-Pab not being on this list. And as much as people are going to get riled up about it, I mean, Good Kid, Mad City, I think as a general kind of pick for the general consensus, I would honestly still go Good Kid, Mad City too. But then it plays into the issue. It's just like, so why did this artist get 2 to 3 albums on this list, but one person only got 1 album? Especially when it comes to their significance. Kanye, for example, only had 1 album on this list as well. So I feel like if you're going to do a top 100 albums list of this magnitude, you really need to keep it to one artist so that way it's centralized and people can not really focus on everything else, but say it's just like, this is the best album from this artist in our opinion. That's why we chose it, and you don't have to scattershot as to why you threw on multiple other albums from multiple different artists. Recency bias, I feel like definitely plays into effect, especially when you consider When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go, and SOS. While those albums are still really good and they're still impactful in their own right, I think it's just way too early to throw them on a top 100 list, in my honest opinion. Some of them I can understand why, because it has been a little bit longer. But I feel like these albums, like, they've only had about a few years to breathe, especially SOS, that's only had like a couple of years to breathe. So I feel like having an album like SOS on this list is just a little bit too early to throw on a top 100 albums, because I feel like more kind of established artists should be on this list, and kind of given the flowers they deserve, especially for albums that have like lived past the test of time and have really proved to be classics and to be long living albums in kind of the cultural landscape of music. And just as a general thing, every list like this encounters backlash, no matter what you do. We're all very subjective people when it comes to music. So the fact that everyone's getting mad at this list is honestly not surprising. It happens every single time. I remember Rolling Stone did their top 500 or top 500 albums of all time, which I think 500 is both a monumentous feat to do and also something that is completely impossible to do, because my goodness, no one's going to read through 500 excerpts of albums. 100 I think is your maximum. But every list that I've encountered over the many years I've been listening to music so far, every list has encountered some level of backlash. And that's the reason why the multiple albums on this list I feel like is one of the biggest ones, because obviously Good Kid, Mad City's on here, but T-Pab isn't on here. There's a couple other examples that really kind of show up here. But overall, I'm going to say, in my honest opinion, this is one of the least controversial lists that I have seen in the past little while. While it still obviously is going to generate controversy and generate discussion, that's the reason why they exist. And I feel like with this list, there are some listings here that I can make sense of, and there's some listings here that is just like, I respect them actually stepping out there and putting it on a list like this. There's quite a bit of albums I can honestly say with that, because obviously I'm not going to go through all of them. But there's some albums on here, it's just like, you know what, that's fair. Or even just like, I would just move this a couple spots down. But regardless, I think this list is honestly not that bad in the general scope of some of the absolute terrible lists that I have seen over the years. So that is my general breakdown of my notables from the top 100 albums from Apple Music of all time. So what are your thoughts? Is there any snubs or anything you would add on to this list? Is there any albums that you replace or any albums that you move higher or lower on the list? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Top 100 albums, as much controversy as they do bring a healthy amount of discussion. So keep checking in for more videos, and thank you very much for watching this one, and have a good night.